So good afternoon, everybody. As you just heard, we are recording this and we're really excited to have you join with us today for this is the third in our series that we've been doing on technologies to help manage seizures that has all been planned and co-hosted with Rob Moss of Seizure Tracker. And we're really thrilled about this being the kind of the third in our series to build on what we've talked about in the past. Our first was on seizure monitoring devices that we did with Danny Did Foundation, talking about the kinds of devices that are out there to really be able to capture these seizures and how that technology is developing. Our second was on seizure tracking, and that was where we were talking a little bit more about how we can use different resources and tools to really follow what is happening with these seizures, marking them down, communicating that data with our clinicians and providers to help us make decisions about treatment. And today, this is really an exciting one because what we're looking at is the future of detecting and forecasting seizure activity, which frankly, I think all of us are interested in being able to do, right? I mean, the more that we can be able to say, we know this is coming, and to be able to either bridge or plan ahead is really an incredible tool to have in our belts. So I'll start just by, well, I'm gonna stop sharing this because people know where they are now. So I should have started by introducing myself. For anybody who doesn't know who I am, I'm Gabi Conacher. I am the co-founder of the International SCN8A Alliance and Deep Connections, which is now growing to be, we have about 35 patient advocacy group partners that we're working with to develop content for families who are severely affected by the DEEs. And you know, we have a new website, a new resource center that we're building to continually add more resources for these families to be able to find guidance and advice about how to manage many, you know, the many things that come up in our lives, whether it's around medical care, whether it's about life with these severe epilepsies or advocacy and research. And we're really thrilled to have you with us. If this is your first, or if you're back again, thanks for joining us. And today we're, as I mentioned, we're kind of jumping into the future a little bit to think about kind of what's on the horizon. And Rob is going to be leading the show today. And if you don't know Rob, Rob Moss's dad to two kids, one of whom, his son Evan, was diagnosed with tuberous sclerosis complex, you know, a rare genetic disease. And he and his wife, out of a labor of love and wanting to better be able to tell what's going on with their son and his seizures, they started seizuretracker.com, and it's really an amazing tool that empowers families to become active in their own treatment and working with their doctors to make informed decisions. And so like Rob, you know, I mean, like us, I think Rob is one of these people who is intensely interested in looking at what we can do with the tools that we have to learn more, help more, find better answers. And so I think the team he's pulled together today is going to be a really thoughtful group to help us think about what's ahead. So Rob, I'm going to turn it over to you. And as we're going through today, if people have questions or comments, feel free to drop them into the comments box or the chat box, excuse me, or the Q&A. We'll mostly save questions for the end, but if there are clarifying questions, we'll try to pop those in to make sure the conversation is clear. So thanks. On to you, Rob.
Thanks, Gabby. So I want to mention too what an honor it is to have been able to collaborate with Deep Connections in this effort to bring this information about technology into your community. So Gabby mentioned that we built Seizure Tracker basically looking for solutions for ourselves, and then we're able to make that public. in the interest of what this discussion is really about, I want to go back a little bit to a personal experience of how we were using Seizure Tracker to really understand Evan's patterns of seizures and communicating those patterns to his care team, and then using the data visualizations and data we collected on Seizure Tracker to really help make informed therapy decisions based on that. So interestingly, we were able to really see that Evan cycled and prove that to his physicians, and then talk about that within the clinical discussions we were having and when we were thinking about therapy. So for an example, Evan would have these status seizures every 14 days or so, and we could look back over a 2-year period and say, look, we see these every 14 days. And there's some fluctuation, but really there are clear indicators that a seizure was impending for him. So we actually were doing preemptive rescue medications for Evan at one point, using data that we collected to try to prevent seizures from happening. So you can imagine that most of us were being responsive to seizure activity, but outside of daily therapies. But this was enabling us to leverage that data in a way that the care team, all of us, felt comfortable in being pretty aggressive about preemptive medication. So just thinking about what we've been talking about in this series specifically, we went over using seizure diaries and those types of tools to enhance the communication with our care team, existing wearables that will help us manage epilepsy, and the unpredictability of seizures. But really what's most exciting, I think, bringing our two speakers together today lets us look to the future of where we can go with collecting this data, new ways to collect the data, but then also what we can do with data that's either collected through devices or by patient diaries. So I'm going to kick this off. I want to introduce Dr. Mark Lehmkuhle. Mark is the CEO, CTO at Epitel. He's got a strong biomedical engineering background, and he's going to talk with us about his efforts to develop and stream seizure detection data, and what that data looks like, and what his efforts has looked like in trying to manage and work with that data to improve lives. So Mark, I'll hand it over to you, and look forward to what you're presenting.
And thank you all for the introduction, and it's an honor to be here. I hope to cover, like you said, the data aspect and the challenges of getting lots and lots of data and analyzing it as much as I can. There'll probably be a little bit of overlap with the devices talks that you've seen earlier, but let's see what we can do here. Let me share my screen.
And as you're pulling up your slides, Mark, I think there was a question that came up about whether these are measuring clinical or subclinical. And I think as you guys are talking today, I think that's a big issue for families. If you can work in anything about measuring either of those.
Absolutely, yeah. Okay, can you see my screen okay?
Good.
Very good, okay, yeah. So we at Epitel are developing a pretty simple wearable that enables remote EEG monitoring no matter where you live. And so our wearable sensors dramatically improve access to EEG. They're intended to increase the probability of effective treatments and outcomes, lower the cost of diagnosis and treatment, and perhaps most importantly, are extremely convenient for people to wear, especially for long periods of time. So home monitoring of seizures is our ultimate goal as a company. And in fact, we think that we can use these wearable sensors to forecast the probability of having a seizure. But there are a number of steps that we need to take to get there. And I'll point out, like I said, the challenges that device manufacturers like ourselves and others face when developing these kinds of sensors. So I promised Rob that I would include as many company sensor technologies as I could, but I just couldn't help myself. So this is a little centric. So bear with me. Okay, so over the last century, we've created powerful tools to diagnose medical conditions. Now, these tools were pretty high resolution, but also incredibly cumbersome. So as you can see here by this old school Holter monitor for recording electrocardiogram at home. And then in the past few decades, we've applied engineering to build far simpler devices. Now, these don't provide as much data as the legacy technology, but in providing sufficient data and being far easier to use, they've now become indispensable. So we and others are doing the same thing for EEG. So what we're trying to do is create a simpler way to measure brain waves. Now, I don't need to tell this crowd how long it takes to get an EEG. You've got all the wires that need to be put on, and then here we have Dr. Tanya Constantino, who is an epileptologist here in Utah, just down the road from us, who then needs to review and interpret that EEG. But with advances in sensor technology, we can remotely connect someone like Dr. Constantino directly to that EEG, even if she's not at the hospital where the scan is being made. So our goal here is to quickly get an EEG going so that a diagnosis can be made quicker. But ultimately, we want to get these sensors into the hands of people and caregivers living with epilepsy so that they too can get an EEG, when they need it the most, where they need it the most at home. So I'll walk through 3 scenarios here where EEG can be improved. And in each scenario, I'll describe the challenges that we face as medical device manufacturers and talk through some examples of what's currently available and what's on the horizon. So here we start off on the left of this slide with in-hospital monitoring, where simply access to EEG and the time it takes to get an EEG can be a big problem. Then we'll start venturing outside of the hospital all the way to what we call home monitoring. And each step involves a higher level of artificial intelligence that makes each of these scenarios possible. So let's start off with simply getting an EEG in an emergency at a hospital. So the fact is that 2/3 of the US population lives further than a 90-minute helicopter ride from neurocritical care. And right now you can walk into the smallest of clinics and get an EKG, but you simply can't get an EEG. The typical solution is to get transported to a much larger hospital that has EEG, but that can take hours. So the first question that we have to ask is, why is that? Well, everyone knows that traditional EEG is not necessarily conducive for use in an emergency. I previously mentioned that your community hospital likely doesn't have an EEG machine, let alone the technicians or the neurologist who knows how to read and interpret that EEG. So availability is one problem, but it's also extremely slow. It can take on average about 4 hours to get an EEG in a hospital that actually has it. And it can take even longer if the EEG is required after hours or on weekends. Finally, once you are hooked up to an EEG, you're pretty much stuck in one spot. So the challenge is in the next slide, I'll kind of show our solution. So in our case, we're using our wireless wearable sensors that we call Epilog, and this is what they look like. If you can still see me, it's a self-contained EEG recording machine, and it attaches to the scalp below the hairline with these one-piece stickers. And the sticker is both an adhesive and a conductive hydrogel. So there's no goopy gels or anything like that. It's all part of a sticker. And it attaches in 4 locations on the scalp, 2 on the forehead and 2 behind each ear. So, and this is part of a platform that we call Remy for remote EEG monitoring. And Remy uses these Epilog sensors to solve the acute EEG access problem. And this platform shown here is what we've gotten FDA clearance on recently. So Remy is designed to connect a neurologist, epileptologist directly to the emergency department or ICU in your neighborhood hospital, no matter how remote or underserved. So those 4 sensors will transmit EEG to a tablet, and the tablet is running software that simply guides through the placement of the sensors and getting a recording session started. So the tablet itself doesn't actually show any EEG at the bedside because most doctors are not trained in reviewing EEG. And so what we're trying to do is simply get it to the neurologist remotely. So the tablet will send that data to the cloud, where we're running a program that most neurologists are familiar with that allows them to log in and remotely review that EEG in almost real time. So then they can make a recommendation back to the emergency department or ICU staff in that community hospital where the EEG is being made. This is by using this combination of wearable sensors, we can create a 10-channel array of EEG that's not as high resolution as a traditional EEG, but anyone can use it. You don't have to be an EEG technician. And it allows a person to get an EEG just about anywhere. So that's kind of step 1. So we've really designed these sensors and this platform to work outside of the hospital. And that's the direction that we're going. And so I have no doubt that this crowd has experienced what this young lady here on the left is going through in the photo, an ambulatory EEG. And so how do we make this scenario better? Well, again, the challenges are availability, the speed at which you can get hooked up, and as you let's see, and you can see that there's all these wires that are coming off. And you've got this turban of gauze, and you've got the recording brick that she's holding. And so this isn't conducive to showering or anything like that. And they're typically limited to about 3 days. So what happens if you don't have a seizure in that 3-day period? Furthermore, the interpretability of an ambulatory EEG can be difficult. As you can see here, she's already tugging on the wires, which creates huge artifacts in the signal. So there's a number of companies trying to solve these 4 problems. So for example, here we've got Brain Scientific. They have a super flexible EEG headset that plugs into virtually every EEG machine out there. Zito has done a remarkable job of making an EEG headset that is quite adjustable for both children and adults. It's completely wireless, gets the data to the cloud, and similar to what I described earlier, it also connects a neurologist directly to that EEG data set. Their system uses dry electrodes, so there's, again, no goopy gels. But perhaps one limitation is that it's not usable for very long, like you can't really sleep with this system. Other companies like BioSerenity are creating let's say a tool chest of sensors that includes EEG, EKG, EMG, and so forth to get a more comprehensive, more mobile set of data that can be used to interpret what's going on, in the comfort of your own home. We are, of course, doing the same thing. To that end, we're swapping out the tablet that I showed previously with our very own smartwatch, initially for ambulatory monitoring with Remy, but ultimately for home seizure monitoring by people living with epilepsy. But there's one more piece to making the system work that you can't see, and that is the artificial intelligence that makes long-term EEG possible. So once we get outside of the hospital, we have the capability of recording weeks and weeks and weeks of EEG with our wearable sensors. So this creates a lot of data, so much so that no neurologist has the time to review it, and it just doesn't fit in their workflow. But by using machine learning, artificial intelligence, we can reduce the time it takes an epileptologist to review EEG. So this is where we are today. Well, not quite. We have a grant from the National Institutes of Health that allows us to develop the artificial intelligence for home monitoring. So we're getting there. Everything I've told you so far uses those 4 sensors, 2 on the forehead and 2 behind each ear. But after someone has been diagnosed with a seizure disorder, we already have a good idea of where to place the sensor. So for example, if someone has right temporal lobe epilepsy, then a person would only need to wear a single sensor, in this case, behind the right ear. And we can detect those seizures with machine learning. So what about long-term monitoring at home? What are the challenges there that we face as a medical device manufacturer? Well, I would say that personal preference is the #1 design criteria for developing a wearable sensor. If you're not willing to wear a sensor for one reason or another, it doesn't matter, then we have failed as a sensor company. We could have the best seizure detection forecasting system out there, but all that doesn't work if the sensors don't fit these criteria. So these sensors absolutely have to be convenient to use. They can't have long set of times or require lots of maintenance. Think of Amazon's one-click buy it now button. Incredibly convenient, right? So a wearable sensor needs to be the same. Usability goes along with convenience, but has more to do with outcomes. So for example, if a sensor is giving you a lot of false alarms, or if you can physically jump up and down and it thinks you're having a seizure, that's just not usable, right? But it can go beyond that. I think it was Tracy Dixon Salazar of the LGS Foundation, who I think it was at a research roundtable once said that, getting an accurate count of the number of seizures that our community is having, probably isn't that important. Maybe getting a better night's sleep would be more important. So in that case, that's another example where a seizure counting tool may not be usable in this case. Let's see, what else is on the list? Specific. Whether you have one seizure a day or one seizure per month, the system has to work for you. And I put in public acceptability here because this one's important to me. That is, are you willing to wear the sensors in public? As you can imagine, putting something on the forehead can be a challenge for attracting attention. And that's a real challenge that we face as medical device manufacturers, especially for recording EEG that, of course, needs to come from the scalp. And the last one here is cost, also very, very important. Then on the right side, we have all the stuff that we need to do as a company to make sure your experience is seamless. All this effectively works behind the scenes, and that if you see any of it, then we're probably not doing our job well. So these are just a few of the challenges that I wanted to highlight. So when it comes to brain health monitoring, seizure detection, seizure alerting, forecasting, there are generally two categories. Direct measures such as EEG, which is recording EEG from the scalp, and indirect measures that are using other biomarkers as surrogates. So out of this entire sample list of 10 companies here, only 2 of them have FDA clearance as medical devices for home seizure monitoring. And that's the Empatica Embrace and the Brain Sentinel Speak. Unfortunately, Brain Sentinel is no longer around. So let's look at Empatica. Do they fit those design criteria that I listed earlier? Is it convenient? Yep, it's worn like a watch. Is it usable and specific? Well, yes, for convulsive seizures, which is what it was designed for. But if you have, let's say, absence seizures, then perhaps it may be not usable. Is it publicly acceptable? They're Italian and the watch is beautiful. So in my opinion, I think yes. And then is it affordable? Well, I'll leave you to be the judge of that. Empatica also does a great job on the technical side of things, of getting the data where it needs to be and getting relevant information back to you. So the Embrace, in my mind, is an excellent sensor. So why don't these other companies here, including ours, why do they not have FDA clearance for home monitoring? Well, it's a combination of both personal preference and technical challenges. So Empatica is using heart rate, accelerometry, and electrodermal response to detect seizures. So all 3 sensors that it's using to detect these convulsive seizures are relatively low bandwidth, meaning that it's easy, relatively speaking, to get the data where it needs to go and analyze it. In fact, they can do a lot of the analysis on the watch itself. Simple. And really, in engineering design, simple is brilliant. EEG, on the other hand, is a higher bandwidth signal. It's harder to get the data where it needs to be without interruptions. And higher bandwidth typically means more power, which means bigger batteries, and so on and so forth. Also, EEG comes from the scalp, so we have that acceptability problem that we face of putting something on the scalp that other people can see and could attract attention that some people living with epilepsy may not want. Lastly, detecting seizures in EEG is really, really hard. It requires artificial intelligence to be usable, the kind of artificial intelligence the FDA hasn't even seen or evaluated yet from a regulatory point. And of course, there is cost that we also need to consider as well. There's no reimbursement for these kinds of sensors. So that means that, that you would have to effectively pay out of pocket. So cost can be a real barrier to home monitoring. As I can't help myself by giving our example, we're trying to create an effective solution for home monitoring by using only a single sensor, like I mentioned, that transmits to a smartwatch, where everything is seamlessly gets pushed to the cloud, where we're running automated seizure detection algorithms. Then through a smartphone app, you'll get an automated seizure diary, real-time seizure alerts, and eventually a forecast of your probability of having a seizure. So stay tuned. We're currently working to get our sensitivity up and our false alarm rate down, so that this sensor system is usable by you. But any success, really, by any one of these companies will be a success for all of us. And happy to talk a little bit more about seizure forecasting, where we're not only using EEG, but other factors like Rob mentioned. Many people seem to have a pattern to their seizures. We can use that information to also include in a seizure forecasting system. We can use heart rate information, all these other biopotentials, and even environmental factors to be used to effectively forecast seizures. And with that, I just want to thank our clinical partners, the NIH and the Epilepsy Foundation, for providing us with grant support. And I hear there will be questions at the end. So happy to answer any questions you have.
Mark, thanks so much. That's it's really cool to hear what y'all are doing as Epitel, but then also sort of the community as a whole. I'm going to introduce Dr. Danielle Goldenholtz. He is an epileptologist at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center. Dr. Goldenholtz and I have been working together a lot on leveraging data within the diary space. So I'm excited to hear sort of the efforts that he's working on, both in the forecasting, but also hopefully we get to talk a little bit about data standardization and how the community is dealing with this type of data. So Dr. Goldenholtz, thank you. Daniel, I'll hand it over to you. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, Rob, and thank you, Gabby, for having me at this little engagement. It's very much appreciated. As was stated, my name is Danielle Goldenholtz. I'm an instructor at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center in Neurology. I'm also the director of the International Seizure Diary Consortium, which is something that Rob played a very instrumental role in building. So you've got the right people here. And all right, so we're going to just jump right in here. And with that, here we go. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the future of epilepsy research enabled by data. And I have some disclosures that have nothing to do with what I'm going to talk about. And I mentioned the International Seizure Diary Consortium. This is a group of international researchers and data providers all over the world who basically want to help patients with epilepsy. And so this is the goal, and we're working on it. So I'm going to discuss a few cool things that we've done and a few cool things that could be done, and we'll see how that kind of connects to the bigger picture. I'm basically going to show you one little slice of the pie, and that's why I've got a pie up there. There's a much bigger world out there with other cool things happening, and this is just sort of mine. So I'm going to talk about some neat things with clinical trial enhancement, things about clinical seizure clustering, as well as seizure susceptibility, seizure cycles, seizure forecasting, and then what comes next. So let's jump in. So actually, this is a really, really long story, and this one slide is actually probably an hour-long talk. So if this feels like a lot, don't worry, it's okay. I just want to give a sort of a hint that there's a lot going on here. So several years ago, we did a study with several different data providers to figure out that placebo response can be reproduced from the ups and downs of seizure frequency alone. And what that means in a clinical trial is that you can actually make it look like there was a trial with a placebo and everything before the trial ever happened. And that's got a big implication for how clinical trials should be or could be run. So we went further and we took seizure tracker data, and we tried to predict what would happen if there was a trial with different design sizes and shapes. And we found things that were expected from more traditional methodology. Again, sort of verifying this idea that the fluctuations in seizures themselves has a very important role to play in understanding how trials worked out. So we built a computational model, and we were actually able to reproduce trial results without even having data anymore. Now we've just got a computer model that can produce placebo responses that are typical. And then we took that a step further and got a little fancy. And we said, if we know about the patients that are joined in the study before they ever get a trial drug or a trial therapy, then we can tell how accurate the trial is going to be from the get-go. So all this stuff, like I said, this is kind of a longer conversation, but this was all enabled by the kinds of data that are being produced from these various sources of data that were talked about before. So jumping topics now to seizure cycles, and this was kind of mentioned by Mark a little bit. In 2018, Max Baud and his colleagues published in Nature Communications this really amazing idea, which is not new, but it was presented in a completely new way with new technology, that there are cycles to seizures and multiple cycles coexisting in one person. So what I mean is that every 12 hours something happens, and every day something happens, and every 7 days something happens, and every month something happens. And all those somethings can happen in one person. So they can have these multiple cycles coexisting in multiple at multiple time scales. And they found this in the RNS data. Well, our team joined up with the NeuroVista team, and we found the same thing going on in seizure tracker data, as well as in the NeuroVista data, that again, there's daily cycles, weekly cycles, and monthly cycles. And those cycles really tell you that there are possible times when it's more likely for seizures and possible times when it's less likely for seizures, which goes back to this idea that seizures maybe aren't unpredictable. Maybe there's something predictable about them. Jumping again, topics. This is a tool that we built with an amazing investigator, Sharon Chang at UCSF. And here we were trying to figure out the following question. What's a seizure cluster? We tried to figure it out based on the literature, and we couldn't figure it out. It didn't make any sense. There was like 10 different definitions, and they were all very arbitrary. And when an individual patient comes to the clinic and says, I'm having clusters right now, and other times I'm not having clusters despite what the book says I'm having, we realized that the definitions that are out there are just not personalized at all. So we figured maybe if we did a statistical approach, we could do better. And sure enough, there are some patients that their diaries are reported to have too many clusters, but really they're not clusters for that person. And then there's other people that none of their things that look like clusters for them are clusters according to the traditional definitions. And these pictures are a little complicated, but basically we had a lot of patients, 1,748 patients, And we thought that a lot of the things that were called clusters according to the traditional methods are due to chance alone, and they're not real clusters based on that person's own pattern. If you use the person's own pattern in our fancy statistical model, then it's maybe 27% of the patients in that group actually have clusters. And some of the clusters can be missed if you use a different definition. So it would be interesting to have a more personalized approach. Connected to this whole idea of your risk going up and down, same investigator, Dr. Sharon Chang, looked at seizure tracker data and tried to figure out, is there like periods of time in the course of a month when you're more or less likely to have seizures, and are you really high risk and really medium risk and really low risk, so that when you go to clinic, you can say to the doctor, things are better, things are worse, things are the same. And she used, again, another advanced statistical model. And we found that it was very helpful. But then we took it a step further and we actually compared what doctors from multiple expert centers were saying, doctors and nurses were saying about patients getting better, patients getting worse. And we found that this technique was as good as the doctors and sometimes better in terms of accuracy. And at all points, it was more reliable. So all of these examples are really saying one thing, that looking at a seizure diary, there's a lot more richness underneath it that you can gain if you start doing some advanced analysis to them. And as I was working on all these other ideas, we started thinking about seizure forecasting. And we thought about it with several different investigators. And finally, we came upon this following question. Seizure forecasting is something we all want to happen. And deep learning is one of the most advanced AI methods that are around right now. If we took seizure tracker data and tried to do deep learning on this data, could we just predict tomorrow's risk of seizures based on 3 months of diary? And that's it, without EEG, without cool sensors, without anything? Is that possible? And sure enough, it was possible. And that kind of astonished all of us. And using 5,419 patients, we got a decent accuracy. And these fancy numbers, the AUC and BSS, basically mean that the accuracy of the algorithm was better than expected from just a chance system. It's got a long ways to go, but the picture on the right shows sort of one of our better example patients where the forecast of tomorrow is shown on the black line. And the forecast is high usually when there's these red seizures, and it's usually low when there's these blue seizures. It makes mistakes, but it was pretty good. We've got plenty of patients where it doesn't work that well, but that's not the point. The point is that this can work at all. And we said, wow, it can work at all without EEG, without fancy sensors. We got to make this better. So that's what we're doing. So what's next? What else can we do? Well, the first thing is there's going to be more data. And there's going to be more data because the electronic health record is going to be connecting to the mobile devices more and more and more. Rob Moss from Seizure Tracker and others are connecting their tools to the electronic medical record so that they will be integrated. So what your doctor knows and what you know at home will be one system. There are newer, cooler devices that are coming to market. Empatica Embrace was mentioned. What you see here is their newer device, which is not yet available, but it's going to be even better than the previous one. It's going to have longer battery life. It's going to be able to detect more stuff. It's got more sensors, et cetera, et cetera. And you already heard from Mark, there are some really great opportunities for outpatient EEG that you can wear in a very private way. And it's going to have very, very long recording times. And there are some new implants. You saw some pictures of these as well. This is one of them from a company called Epiminder. And these folks are one of several companies out there trying to do a similar idea, which is implanting a device just under the skin, above the bone, so not on the brain, above the bone. So it's an easy outpatient procedure to install this thing, but then you've got reliable sensors that are living there for months or years and can give you reliable EEG information that can be transmitted wirelessly. This stuff is going to change the game completely, because then we're going to suddenly know about seizures that the patients themselves don't know about. Okay, so we're going to have more data. And then we're going to be more connected. So the whole patient is still not connected, right? My smartwatch and my phone are starting to talk to each other a little bit, although anyone that has a smartwatch knows there's still problems there. My computer and my phone kind of talk to each other, but not totally. My blood pressure knows nothing about my weight, and my weight knows nothing about my glucose, and my heart rate, and so on and so on. There's all these different things that I could measure and connect, but they're really all living in their own systems. So when they're all connected together is when they can really help me, the patient, and not just cool little devices and gadgets. Being more connected to the doctor is a big deal. As a physician, I don't know what's going on with all my patients all the time, and there's no easy way to check in on them except calling all of them, and that is not practical. But there are going to be better ways that we can all be connected, and we can all check in on each other in more advanced ways and more automated ways. Similarly, there's going to be ways now, and there are coming ways in the future, where patients that are similar to me can learn from each other before the doctor ever teaches them anything. And they can bring these new insights to their doctors and to researchers and to each other. And this has been going on for some time, but I think that this is going to be accelerated as time goes on and we live more in a connected world. The third thing is the more AI, and Mark mentioned this quite a bit, and he's right. AI is basically permeating everything that we do. We're going to get our diagnosis of everything sooner because AI is able to do a better job than people are. We're going to get more personalized treatment, and I showed you a couple examples of how that might work. But there's many more examples coming because every time there's some more data and some more connection, then we can add AI to that and we can make it more personalized. And then we can talk about early warnings like seizure is coming, or the risk of your surgery is good, bad, etc. Or maybe this medicine is not for you anymore because of the other mixtures of things that you're taking, or because of today's risk level, etc. So to summarize, we've got more data, we've got more connection, and we've got more AI coming. All of these things are what's on the radar in the medium term, but people like Mark are today building the tools that we need for those exact things. You know, there's a lot more here, but I just wanted to provide a little bit of an overview and a little bit of taste of a lot of different things. So feel free to reach out by email if you have further questions. Thanks again.
Thanks, Dr. Goldenholtz. Gabby, I'm gonna just hand it over to you to sort of inject some of the questions out of the Q&A tool. I'm talking about these issues every day, so I love to be able to converse with both Mark and Danielle on a regular basis about these things, but I'd love to make sure we're answering questions in the community as well.
Yeah, so I think a number of things came up, but first of all, that was really eye-opening. So thank you to both of you for sharing your insights and the exciting work that you're doing. I guess one of the key things that came up was asking about what kind of seizures, right? We said, oh, like Mark, you were saying, you know, these can potentially detect, certain kinds, but like if you have absence seizures, you're not going to find that, right? So is there a better sense about, first of all, clinical versus subclinical and seizure type of detection?
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, in all the cases that we have recorded EEG with our sensors has always been alongside that gold standard. And one of the reasons being is more technical, that we need, you know, really clean data for training artificial intelligence algorithms. But we also want to be able to detect as many different seizures as we can. And that includes both non-convulsive or subclinical seizures and focal onset seizures that may not result in a convulsion, or even those generalized seizures like absence seizures that also don't really result in a behavioral manifestation. So one of the advantages of recording EEG is that you get all the different seizure types. So whether that's a subscalp implantable system or a wearable system, anything that you would record in a standard EEG, we can also record. So in that case, we do have examples of absence seizures that we can detect, as well as even focal onset seizures with intact awareness. So we're really trying to create a solution that will detect all the different seizure types. And of course, forecast them.
Did you want to add anything, Dr. Goldenholtz?
I agree. I think that all the different seizure types matter, obviously. And I think that we currently are in the desert. I don't know when my patients have seizures and when they don't. And many of them also don't. When they tell me they did, and they're quite sure, I don't know if they're missing stuff. I don't know if they're forgetting stuff. The literature claims that patients underreport and overreport to the extent that I can trust about 50% of what they say, according to the literature.
Yeah.
That's terrible.
Yeah.
So I'm hoping that Mark can fix this for me. I'm realistic that Mark will fix some of it, because there's no technology that ever fixes everything for a medical problem. It ends up being a combination of different kinds of technologies. And Patica seems to be very good at generalized tonic-clonic seizures. And that's really, really important. We need to know about those. And some patients don't even realize when they have them. There's probably going to be a whole bunch of seizures that Mark's tools are going to be able to tell us about that no other device is going to be able to do a great job on. And some of these implantables may be the only one that's going to be able to tell us about certain other ones. And there's going to be other technologies that are coming along, and we're going to, we're keeping our eye out for everything, and we're going to keep track of everything. And we're going to use everything that we know is actually proven to be helpful to our patients. So the answer is we need more, a lot more.
Right. And I think, like you were mentioning, those subclinical ones are likely going to be the one that's going to giving us more accurate data, right?
Well, the subclinical ones have been measured with responsive neurostimulation and with the implanted NeuroVista trial and so forth. Do we need those? That's an open, we still don't know for sure. We think we need those. It'd be nice to know them. We'd be nice to get rid of them with our therapies and so forth. But until we even know when they are, then we can't really be sure if we hate them as much as we think we do.
Gabby, and to chime in here a little bit, I think this goes to a little bit of Mark's conversation about device specificity. So no device is going to be perfect for everyone. And actually, it's probably more the case that one device is going to be okay for some people and really bad for other people. And that goes to the fact that we need to have a good communication with our care team. We have to have tools that will help us evaluate when these systems are set up for specific types of people and personalize this technology to each patient and really put the patient at the center of the decision making, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think a really important point was just brought up too, and you kind of got to this, Dr. Goldenholtz, which is about how much can you really trust the data that is coming from, well, first of all, there's people who have epilepsy themselves who are doing self-reporting, right? And there's lots of problems there. Then there's caregiver reported, right? That's most of us on this call are people that are observing our children and saying, was that a seizure? I don't know. I think that was a seizure. I'm not sure if that was a seizure, but I'm going to track it as a seizure, right? And then being able to really trust the data that you're getting. And I think the example that was brought up was that it's nearly universal that doctors expect tracking data for like patients with diabetes, right? And that there's clean data for the most part. You can get a sense of what's happening, and why there doesn't seem to be a stronger desire or imperative from clinicians to be getting better tracked data.
I'll just say we all want it and we always did. In diabetes, they're lucky enough that there's a blood test that they can use that makes it easy for them. We don't have the luxury yet of a blood test like that, although there are some hints that there may be a possibility of a blood test based on microRNA. We're not there yet. And until we're there, we're stuck in this imperfect world where we take the word of the caregiver and the patient, and we hope that that's, the information that we have is as good as it's going to get. But we definitely do need more, and there is a strong imperative, and that's exactly why Mark's company exists. I think that a lot of people recognize this deficit, and a lot of people are working hard on it.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think this is going to be this is going to change the game for clinical trials too, right? I mean, to really be able to say pre-post kind of what we're seeing. And I think for everybody on this call have no doubt that some of these newer tools are going to save us a lot of time and headache and improve accuracy, right? Like actually being hooked up to something when you actually are having seizures in your own environment, you know, not having leads and EEG hair and all of that, right? And, you know, and frankly, something that's very important to me and people on the call today or people listening in down the line is accessibility, right? Like this is EEG and Mark, that map you showed of the United States and just these dead zones. It's so scary. And then you take that and you move it to countries, right? Where I mean, I did a lot of work in Africa, right? I mean, it would just be one big red zone, right? There's like a couple of capital cities where you can find even an EEG machine. But so what is the future? Obviously these are nascent, right? But what do you think these kinds of tools will do for accessibility to treatment? Well, treatment's a different story, but better monitoring and data around what we're experiencing. And then obviously, you know, there are treatments down the line, but.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, one of the biggest use cases for these sensors that I see for use at home could be using them to optimize treatment, to find the right treatment faster, balance side effects with seizure control, really allow people to kind of take control more of something that they have no control over. Mm-hmm. And then, you know, especially with forecasting, you know, the NeuroVista trial was a great example where it really empowered people to really determine what their risk level was for seeing their probability of having a seizure. In a lot of cases, you know, even if people saw that they had maybe a 50-50 chance, it still gave them some information that they could use to plan their day. Mm-hmm. And of course, you know, when we talk about seizure forecasting and subclinical seizures, for example, it's really going to be personalized because, you know, perhaps subclinical seizures don't affect someone's quality of life, but the convulsive seizures absolutely, you know, currently would certainly. So, you know, I think giving them that tool to balance what they're comfortable with is going to be important.
Mm-hmm.
I would just add that, you know, to getting back to your point about Africa and the United States, first of all, there's not a lot of places that are epilepsy centers that are like high level, you know, subspecialty trained docs available. Right. So if you have epilepsy in this country, then maybe you have an epileptologist, more likely you have a neurologist, or maybe you just have a primary care doctor. Mm-hmm. So tools like Mark's and other tools that incorporate artificial intelligence to bring the equivalent of an expert to the masses are exactly what we're missing right now. When a non-expert is taking care of the patient, can they give them expert level care? Yeah. And I think that it's possible when we have these more advanced tools available to us. A perfect analogy is that my cell phone now allows me to take expert level photographs, and I am not a photographer, but it does image stabilization and it corrects the colors and it adjusts the focus and all the stuff that I never understood how to do to begin with. Right. Now it just does it for me. And I think that the idea would be when we have a patient who is not coupled up with an expert epileptologist, that's okay, because the tools that an expert epileptologist would use would be available to a wider community of people. If we move outside of the US, it's the same problem, only it's worse. There's not enough experts for the patients that need those experts. And, you know, I heard a talk recently from a bunch of Indian doctors. And in India, the problem is people, you know, they have EEG machines available, but they don't have the experts around to read them. So patients are not getting their diagnosis. Forget about everything. They just don't even know they have epilepsy.
Yeah.
So we need to bring tools to people, but then we need to bring an expert that lives in a little box that you don't have to feed. And you just give that that expert and the tool. And I think that we can help a lot more people than we are now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's the critical piece too, right? Is that it's not just these devices, but it's the AI behind them, because it's just massive, massive amounts of data, right? And improving our ability to have machines tell us what's happening is going to be critical. Yeah. So we got something in the chat here about that some families observe early signs of seizures and take action, like giving, bridging meds or extra doses of a rescue med. So can you discuss how refinement of these potential prediction tools might inform such preventative action to prevent or mitigate bad seizures? So, yeah, are we going to be able to stop the seizures from happening if we can predict them?
I'll just say that, I mean, that's the dream, right? I want to know when the seizure is going to happen so that I can prevent it from ever happening. The dream is, to make it more specific, the dream is to know when it's going to happen, and then automatically, without anybody doing anything, automatically treat the possibility that it's going to be a seizure so that it doesn't happen. Now, sure, until we have an automatic thing, then I want the little red light, green light, and then I want to pop a pill or an injection or an inhaler or whatever. But it shouldn't be too long before that's silly. I mean, look, again, going back to diabetes, look at how diabetes works now. You can have a device that is attached to your body and it's measuring your blood sugar all the time. You can have another device that's attached to your body that's providing you the therapy that you need when you need it. And you can dial both of them if you want to, or you can connect them wirelessly and let them just do their thing. And that's exactly what we need for epilepsy. We need something that's measuring all the time, an AI that's understanding what the measurement is, and then a therapy or group of therapies that are automatically being delivered where they need them, when they need them, and never at any other time. And I think that there is a lot of people working on that. And I think that that's where we're going. So I absolutely agree that if I knew the risk was high and treatment would help, then exactly what the questioners said, which is, when I know the risk is high, I should do treatment early in order to prevent the thing from happening. But I need to know that it works, otherwise don't, right? And we're just at the beginning of this game because we're still trying to figure out exactly when is the risk high.
So, and to chime in here, Dr. Goldenholtz, can you just comment about the more recent trials approving the new rescue medications within acute repetitive seizures? So that's a kind of an example of this, where we're treating preemptively as a part of a cluster of seizures. Can you just talk about how we justified an FDA approval for a specific therapy that is preemptive in that aspect?
So I have to, I'm revealing my biases, right? I said that I'm not totally convinced about some of these definitions of clusters, but let's pretend that the definitions were totally 100% awesome. So if a definition of a cluster is awesome, we also know separately that a cluster sometimes is a hint that status epilepticus is coming, a prolonged seizure that's dangerous. Well, we hate those. And so if I have a cluster and I'm worried about status, it better get my rescue medicine in order to prevent something bigger and badder. And so I think that the goal with rescue medicines for clusters is, I don't want to show up in the hospital. I don't want to be in the emergency room with a tube down my throat. I want to stay home, stay safe. And a little seizure followed by another little seizure might mean bigger stuff is coming. So the idea behind treating clusters is to prevent something bigger. So it is actually like what we're saying with seizure risk going up, taking a treatment in order to push it back down. How perfect is this idea? That's a different story. How perfect is the definition of what's a cluster? That's a different story. Does it help to take a rescue medicine to reduce the risk for seizures in the short term? It does work. We check that. And that's why it was approved. Are we treating exactly when we need to for all the people and all the times? I'm not sure. I hope we are, but I think that we can do better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we're coming up against time here, but I think there's so much potential for, you know, truly changing the lives of a lot of families here. I mean, I see a friend on the webinar here who every time her daughter has a seizure, it is a major event. They know that, you know, they don't wait 3 minutes for rescue meds. They go into emergency mode right away. They're bagging, you know, and it's like, if you could tell that this is coming and be able to prevent that, that is an incredible shift in quality of life and saving this child's brain, right, from just constantly being assaulted. So this is a webinar of hope. I hope people are feeling that the horizon is not too far off. And, you know, I think, you know, we did have some people asking about, you know, what is the timeline for availability? What about outside of the US? You know, that I imagine is probably going to take longer. You know, I don't know, Mark, you're tracking this. What do you envision?
Yeah. For us, you know, the timeline is for home monitoring is about 2 to 3 years, roughly. We think we can reasonably get something. It might not be the best initially from an EEG perspective, but that's what we're shooting for is roughly 2 to 3 years. At least on our end. Now there's other companies out there that are, you know, for example, Empatica, of course, is already on the market, and now they're coming out with, I think that's their third product. And RNS, of course, is probably the closest thing we have to a recording and stimulation system that is automatic.
Yeah.
And so we'll see constant improvements as we go.
Right. Yeah.
Unfortunately, they just take some time.
Yeah, no, I think it's, you know, for those of us who've had kids a while already dealing with this, we're still living it and having a lot of challenges, and wish this had come sooner, but really grateful that y'all are working on this for the next generation of kids and people living with these, you know, really destructive epilepsies. And I think that, you know, and thanks to you, Rob, and people who are gathering, you know, building these massive databases for us to learn to, you know, I come from a public health background where we want to be looking at everything we have to make clear decisions. And hopefully this personalized medicine piece isn't too far off either, where we can start saying, this is what this person is presenting with, and therefore what they need. And that's when we'll be able to figure out what device is right, what treatments are right, all of those kinds of things. So thank you. This is an incredible session. I think that we'll, you know, we'll be pushing this to help give people some hope about what's on the horizon, and keep up the great work.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gabby. Yep.
Thanks so much, everybody. Take care.